Now, you remember the evolutionary view, that we have different animals on different continents because they evolved in these different parts of the world? Well, according to the theory of evolution, jaguars and lions are descended from a common ancestor that lived around 3 million years ago. And after 3 million years of evolution, we're told, we got jaguars in South America and lions in Africa. But it's possible to mate a jaguar and a lion and get a hybrid, a jag-lion. If these two species, jaguars and lions, were really separated by 3 million years of evolution, it is most unlikely that their mutated DNA would allow them to hybridize. Evolutionists face an even bigger problem trying to explain hybrids between jaguars and leopards. And this is because the female of this kind of hybrid is fertile. Think about it. 3 million years of separate evolution. Half the time it allegedly took for ape-like creatures to evolve into people. And the hybrid is still fertile. I don't think so. But the ability of these big cats to hybridize fits the biblical account of Earth history very well. You see, if jaguars and lions and tigers and so on are all descended from a pair of cats that stepped off the ark around 4,500 years ago, it's not surprising that they can mate and produce offspring. Arguably, evolutionists face an even greater problem with the iguanas of the Galapagos Islands. The land and marine iguanas supposedly separated from their common evolutionary ancestor around 10 million years ago. But as we pointed out in our Darwin documentary, land and marine iguanas can mate and produce offspring. This amazed evolutionists when they first saw it. In the evolutionary view, South America and Africa were joined for millions of years. Why then are there more seed plants common to South America and Asia than to South America and Africa? Of around 200 seed plant families native to East and South America, only 156 are common to Eastern South America and Western Africa, whereas around 174 are common to Eastern South America and Eastern Asia. If South America and Africa had really been joined for millions of years, we would expect to find exactly the opposite. We would expect there to be more plants common to South America and Africa than to South America and Asia. Do you see the problem here for the ancient earthers? They say that South America and Africa were joined for millions of years. But there are more seed plant families common to South America and Asia than to South America and Africa. This is a statement by Dr. Simon Mayo of the Royal Botanic Gardens near London. He said, "The overall similarity of the plants of the two continents is surprisingly low, given such a clear geophysical background." Dr. Mayo expresses surprise that there are so few plants common to South America and Africa. Why is he so surprised? Well, he believes that these two continents were joined for millions of years. But the whereabouts of plants doesn't support this view. Some biogeographers have found this kind of data so puzzling, they have argued against the geologists' model of a supercontinent Pangaea, where South America and Africa were joined, and have suggested instead that there was a supercontinent they called Pacifica, where South America and Asia were joined. If the ancient Earth view were correct, we would expect the models and the data of the ancient Earth biogeographers to be consistent with the models and data of the ancient Earth geologists. We would expect them to be harmonious, but they're not. Often, they're markedly contradictory. We find monkeys in South America, Africa, and Asia. For example, we find the spider monkey in South America, the olive baboon in Africa, the langur in India, and macaques in Japan. Now, evolutionists tell us that monkeys evolved in Africa. Well, it's not difficult to see how they might have migrated to Asia. But how did they get to South America? You see, according to the theory of evolution, South America split off from Africa millions of years before monkeys had evolved. Evolutionists have similar problems explaining why we find rodents and some flowering plants on both these continents, because again, they are said to have evolved millions of years after South America split off from Africa. Currently, the western tip of Alaska is very close to the eastern tip of Asia. They are separated only by the very narrow Bering Strait. In fact, many people believe that in the recent past, these two parts of the world were joined. But according to evolutionists and their theory of slow continental drift, this has only been so for around 10 million years. Not for very long in their thinking. Prior to this, in the supercontinent Pangaea, Alaska and Asia were separated by thousands of miles of ocean, by all the water on the far side of the globe. Now we find plant fossils of the same species in rocks either side of the Bering Strait. And these rocks were laid down in what evolutionists would call the Jurassic period. But the Jurassic period, we're told, ended around 150 million years ago. So according to this thinking, these identical plant fossils were buried at least 150 million years ago. Do you see the problem here for the ancient earthers? In their thinking, if we go back over 150 million years, Eastern Asia and Alaska weren't close to one another, as we see on this slide. They were separated by thousands of miles of ocean. Why then do we find plant fossils of the same species buried in Jurassic rocks in these two very distant regions? And this is yet another example of the kinds of conflict that arise between ancient Earth biogeography and ancient Earth geology. Many plants and animals are found only in the northern and southern regions. Crowberries are one example. It certainly can't be said of these that they are found where they are, because that's where they evolved. There are so many plants and animals found only in the northern and southern regions, and not in between, that some biogeographers have made the astonishing suggestion that these two parts of the world were once in contact. They have seriously suggested, based on biogeographic data, that the arrangement of the continents in the past was such that the northern and southern regions were joined. So again, we see the thinking and the views of the ancient Earth biogeographers in conflict with the thinking and views of the ancient Earth geologists, few of whom would have much time for the idea that the northern and southern regions were once joined. So how might we explain biogeography within the framework of biblical Earth history?
Another objection is that the specialization of animals that we have today. Koalas, for example, survive on a eucalyptus diet pretty much exclusively.
Right.
But that specialization has come over time. It's been discovered actually that koalas are sort of addicted to eucalyptus. It's like a drug.
They're born junkies, actually.
Born junkies, yeah. They wouldn't have been that specialized in the past, and of course evolutionists know that very well. You have natural selection and artificial selection to some in some varieties that specialize animals, so that today they only eat a certain type of food. Wouldn't have been that way in the past.
Because koalas can eat 20-some different types of gum leaves, and koalas that are weaned, from a very bottle-fed ones that are not fed eucalyptus right off the bat, they can eat different kinds of diet. Things like giant pandas, they normally eat bamboo shoots and things like that.
Right.
But it's been discovered that they also eat small animals. And so you can see too that maybe creatures were eating one thing in the past and now they're eating new things because perhaps just the food availability is different. And so it doesn't mean that they have to eat what they're eating, is what I'm saying. Is in the past, maybe there were different things, they were eating different things because of different opportunities.
So there's solutions to those kinds of problems. Here's another possibility for the distribution of animals and perhaps people after the flood. Vegetation mats. You can see a picture here of a floating vegetation mat. You have things like slow-moving creatures like the sloth, and people say, well,
how did he get there?
There's the ultimate lazy creature. Yeah. How did the sloth get from the Middle East to where we find sloths now? Well, you have these possibilities, these floating vegetation mats.
Right. Any evolutionists have proposed that even certain primates may have traveled hundreds of kilometers on floating log mats, etc. For example, iguanas have been found to be doing that too, traveling in between islands on floating vegetation.
Well, this is an article I wrote for Creation magazine, in which I explain what some creationists believe to be one of the primary means by which plants and small animals spread around the world after the Genesis flood. And I'm referring to the hypothesis that this was by rafting on log mats driven by ocean currents. Interestingly, a growing number of evolutionists are proposing rafting as an explanation for how some plants and animals migrated from one island to another, or even from one continent to another. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, a tsunami was generated in the nearby Spirit Lake. And this caused around 1 million trees to be uprooted from the surrounding hillside. And these eventually settled on the lake as an enormous log mat. Following the great earthquake off the coast of Japan in 2011 and the resulting tsunami, a trail of debris formed in the Pacific Ocean around 70 miles long and covering an area of over 2 million square feet. Now, the effects of the Mount St. Helens and Japanese tsunamis were nothing as compared with the destruction that would have been wrought by a global flood. The flood we read about in the book of Genesis would have resulted in billions of trees being left floating on the surface of the oceans. And these log mats would have been like enormous floating islands. And regularly watered by rainfall, they could have easily transported plants and small animals great distances. Some creationists believe that the pre-flood world included great floating forests, a bit like the quaking bogs that we know today. Perhaps these were broken up during the Great Flood as well and became rafts. The ability of ocean currents to distribute floating objects around the world was seen recently when thousands of bathtub rubber ducks were lost off a container ship in the North Pacific. Within just a few months, these had floated to Indonesia, Australasia, and South America, and subsequently they floated into the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans. And often we find plants distributed along coastlines and islands. This shows the distribution of the sago palm. It's found in East Africa, Madagascar, the tip of India, and parts of Indonesia and Australasia. Pelargonium is another example. It's found right out in the Atlantic, in South Africa, Madagascar, East Africa, India, Sri Lanka, southern Australia and New Zealand. Here's another example, this time a type of fern plant, Strangeriaceae. It's found in South Africa and along the eastern coast of Australia. This shows the distribution of a plant called hook and arn, a member of the carrot family. And based on the routes taken by the rubber ducks, it seems very reasonable to believe that rafting explains this. We can see here how the rubber ducks floated to North and South America. A prominent feature of biogeography is what's called tracks of dispersal. This is an example. It shows how Oreobolus plants dispersed throughout Indonesia, Australasia, and across the Pacific Ocean. And what's so significant about this is that many other plants and animals have followed a similar route. Note 2, incidentally, there's no direction implied on this slide, no direction of dispersal. Note 2, that all the plants and animals following this track are found either side of the Pacific Ocean. Now, when the habitats of plants and animals are broken by land or water, it's known as a disjunction. So we might say that all these plants and animals are disjunct across the Pacific. That's an important word, an important concept for a little later in the presentation, a disjunction, where the same plants and animals are separated by land or water. Now, textbooks typically show the main biogeographic regions like this. This is the map for animals, showing 6 main faunal or animal regions, regions where we tend to find the same sort of animals. But these kinds of diagrams are really oversimplifications. A more realistic picture is like this, where we find many different plants and animals concentrated in small regions. And these are known as areas of endemism. Now, endemic means native or restricted to a particular area. And an area of endemism is one where there are a high number of endemic species, where many different species are found in the same small, distinct regions. And here, each colour represents one of those regions. Interestingly, areas of high plant endemism often coincide with areas of high animal endemism. So these areas where we find lots of different plant species concentrated together tend to be the same as the areas where we find lots of different animal species concentrated together. And many areas of endemism are coastal regions and islands. For example, the tropical Andes, shown here enclosed in red on the left, is the richest and most diverse plant region on Earth. It contains around 15% of all the world's plant life in less than 1% of the world's land area. Around 20,000 of its 40,000 plant species are endemic. The area of Sunderland, enclosed in green to the right, contains 15,000 endemic plant species. And the island of Madagascar, enclosed in blue, has over 9,000 endemic plant species. We also find many similarities between these regions, where the same plants and animals are distributed around or either side of an ocean. And there are numerous patterns of disjunction like this, where again and again we find the same plants and animals in the same widely separated areas. And I think that's the key to explaining biogeography. In the last century, a man called Léon Crozat plotted many tracks like these, showing dispersal routes across the world. And each of these lines is known as a generalized track, where many different plants follow the same route. Crozat's work emphasized that there are many tracks that cross oceans, and many tracks that follow coastlines. We see one here going right the way across the Arctic coast, another going down the eastern side of North and South America, tracks covering much of the coast of Africa, down the coast of Eastern Asia, and down the western coasts of North and South America. We can see that on the right. Crozat's work made clear that many tracks of dispersal either cross oceans or follow coastlines. A good case can be made for the biogeographic regions being the oceans rather than the continents. Christopher Humphreys of the Natural History Museum in London and Lynn Parenti of the Smithsonian Institution wrote this: "Characteristically, many disjunct patterns span ocean bottoms, to the point that the oceans have been characterized as the natural biogeographic regions, and the continents represent the land areas around the periphery." And to me, this is very strong evidence supporting the rafting hypothesis, that transport across oceans explains much of the biogeography of the world. I believe that many plants and small animals were transported on great log mats left over from the Genesis flood. And the areas of endemism we see today correspond to the landing places of these rafts. Interestingly, researchers at Bryan College in Tennessee show that the intersections of ocean currents with the continents tend to coincide with these areas of endemism. We see, for example, a number of currents circulating around the Pacific, also the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. So it's reasonable to think that ocean currents would have transported the log mats to these areas. Just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that small animals survived the flood on rafts. Rather, that the rafts would have facilitated their dispersal after the flood as they multiplied and migrated away from the ark's final resting place. Another way animals could have spread around the world is through migration across land bridges that are now below sea level. We believe that soon after the Genesis flood there was an ice age. We don't believe in many ice ages, just one. And conditions would have been ideal for an ice age after the flood. The oceans would have been warm due to hot underground water being added to them at the beginning of the flood. And this warming of the oceans would have caused lots of water to evaporate into the atmosphere. At the same time, all the volcanoes erupting during and after the flood would have thrown lots of dust into the air, and this would have blocked some of the sun's heat, keeping the continents cool. So all this water vapour in the atmosphere would have fallen as snow, building up significant amounts of ice on the land. And sea levels would have dropped, as the ocean's water evaporated and was then trapped on the continents as ice sheets. And land bridges would have appeared as sea level dropped. I think then it's reasonable to understand that there was a land bridge across what is now the Bering Strait, and a number of land bridges linking parts of Indonesia and also possibly Australasia. Of course, we don't see these land bridges today because much of the ice has now melted and sea levels have risen again. Also, due to continued geological activity after the flood, other land bridges may have fallen below sea level. So it's not difficult to imagine how animals could have migrated to Ararat, to various places around the world. Well, what about marsupials? All those Australian animals that carry and suckle their young in pouches at the front of their bodies.
Right. Did the kangaroo hop all the way to Australia? Well,
from the Middle East?
There have been isolated reports of individual animals making startling journeys thousands of kilometers.
Right.
Like rabbits were introduced to a small part of Australia. Now they cover all of Australia. And they covered Australia in a short amount of time.
Right.
People thought rabbits couldn't possibly expand that fast.
Right, so you're not talking about one animal actually traveling that far. Obviously they live and they repopulate, yes. And then it grows and grows. Fossils, some people say, yeah, but wait a sec, if all the animals got off the ark somewhere in Turkey and then moved apart, well, how come we don't find their fossils there?
Right.
Right? But
hey Brain Stuff, it's me, Jonathan. Sometimes in a lull between events at CES, I'm digging a 6-foot hole in the middle of the desert outside Las Vegas, and I start to wonder, where are all the dead animals? You can probably guess that not every animal that dies leaves behind fossil evidence, but why is that? Just to get our terms straight, a fossil is any physical remnant left behind by an organism that died long ago. In many cases, fossils might only be things like preserved footprints or nest sites. But today, we're looking at direct remains of animal bodies, like bones. The likelihood that any particular animal body will become fossilized is amazingly small. Way less than 1%. I mean, you might as well buy a lottery ticket. So let's look at the stations of the obstacle course to fossilization. First, there's body type. Fossilization has a strong preference for animals with hard body parts like bones, teeth, and shells. Animals with soft bodies like slugs and jellyfish will usually just decompose completely and disappear after death. The second main hurdle to fossilization is exposure. To become a fossil, you need to be one of the rare animal bodies that is rapidly buried soon after the animal dies. This is most likely to happen in or near the site of a moving body of water, like a river or a floodplain, where runoff, floodwaters, or regular flow may quickly cover a dead body in sediment. It might also happen in arid desert settings, where wind can quickly bury animal remains in sand dunes. If the remains are not rapidly buried, scavenging animals are likely to scatter and consume them. After all, nature hates to pass up a free lunch. We're alike in that way. And even a clean skeleton left out exposed to the elements will eventually be erased by decalcification, erosion, and corrosion. But let's say your bones are lucky enough to be rapidly buried somehow. The next big hurdle is the sediment itself. A nice dry sand or alkaline mud might be a good place to become a fossil. But if your bones are buried in soil with a higher temperature and higher acidity, your prospects are a lot slimmer. Acidic environments, meaning soils with a low pH, tend to dissolve hydroxyapatite, a calcium phosphate mineral that is a main structural ingredient in our bones. So, many soil types on Earth will simply destroy all the bones they swallow. I'm counting on it, I kid. But even in friendly sediment, over a long enough period of time, bones can break down. The organic proteins in bones, like collagen, eventually decompose, and the inorganic minerals in bones can be crushed, dissolved, or otherwise destroyed by physical forces over the centuries. So, if you want your actual bone structure to survive, you have to be lucky enough to undergo a little transformation. Most really ancient bones we find, such as dinosaur dinosaur bones aren't the unaltered original bones that were buried millions of years ago, but either minerally modified versions of those bones or stone photocopies. Two processes represent the majority of these cases: permineralization and replacement. In permineralization, mineral-rich water seeps into the buried bones and fills the pores of the bones with its mineral content. These minerals form crystals inside the bones, causing them to modify and harden over time. Sometimes this process is also called petrification. In replacement, the original bones can be completely dissolved, but still leave fossil copies, as the minerals in the groundwater completely replace the shape of the bones over long periods of time. So, let's say you're the rare dead animal that wins the fossilization lottery and you just happen to pass all these tests. You still have to be found. The total surface of the Earth is almost 200 million square miles. And even for a guy like me, there's only so much time to dig.
A bigger shock came in 1991 when a fossil platypus was found in South America.
That's right. So since evolutionists believe that all organisms have a common ancestor, migration between Australia and other areas has to be conceded as possible by scientists, whether you're a creationist or evolutionist or not. If we have live living platypus today in Australia and fossil ones in South America.
Well, we do find marsupials elsewhere in some parts of America. But most marsupials are found in Australia and New Guinea, and many of these are found nowhere else. So how can we explain this within the framework of biblical Earth history? Well, I don't have any firm answers, but I can outline one possibility that I think is quite plausible. Now, you remember we're dealing here with two types of mammal: placentals and marsupials. And there's some evidence to suggest that placentals tend to outcompete marsupials when they share the same habitats. And from a biblical point of view, this does seem plausible. Marsupials would have stepped off the ark alongside placentals and would have lived around the Middle East and the surrounding continents. Yet only placentals live in those places today. It seems significant that North America has only one marsupial, the Virginia opossum. Marsupials have become well established in Australia, but largely in the absence of placentals. I suspect that competition from placentals drove marsupials to migrate away from the ark ahead of the placentals. Marsupials then gained an early foothold in Australia and South America, and without competition from placentals, they thrived in those places. And perhaps as the log rafts broke up and sea levels rose and covered the land bridges, Australia and South America became more or less completely isolated before very many placentals had made their way to those continents. So, driven by competition from placentals, marsupials may have migrated to Australia and South America and then been protected from placental competition as these continents were cut off from the rest of the world. Fossils of marsupials are found on every continent. So in evolutionary thinking, marsupials died out on all the continents except the ones where we find them today. Why then can't creationists simply argue the same? Also, there are some interesting twists in the evolutionary story about marsupials. If in evolutionary thinking we go back to the late Cretaceous period, allegedly around 65 to 80 million years ago, we don't find any marsupial fossils in either Australia or South America. At that period, they're found only in Europe, Asia, and North America. An article in Science magazine said this: living marsupials are restricted to Australia and South America. In contrast, marsupial fossils from the late Cretaceous are exclusively from Eurasia and North America. This geographical switch remains unexplained. So again, according to evolutionists, 65 million years ago, marsupials lived in Europe, Asia and North America. They then died out in those continents and now live in Australia and South America. Well, if evolutionists can have marsupials dying out in Europe, Asia and North America, surely creationists can too.
Also, in a lot of recent literature, you'll see the suggestion, even in an evolutionary framework, of people suggesting that perhaps we were better boat builders in the past than had been previously thought.
Yeah.
Of course, creationists have always believed that because we believe Noah built a great boat. But you'll see that this notion that perhaps we were taking animals around the world with us as we were traveling in the past. For example, here's a picture, a mosaic from the Villa Romana del Casale, and it's located in Sicily. And this villa was built between 310 and 340 AD, possibly as a hunting lodge or something like that. And what you can see in the pictures is it depicts people transporting exotic animals, things like elephants and what looks like an emu or an ostrich and things like that. Now, what was that for? Maybe for the Roman games or something, we don't know, but it just shows that people have recorded this in the past. Humans obviously have the ability to capture animals and move them around different continents.
That's yet another possibility for answering this question.
Exactly.
As to how did animals and people get distributed after the flood?